So you're very welcome today to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Yeah, great. I've really enjoyed Manesh your work over the last number of years. You know, I love your very open kind of you boil down the psychedelic science so that the ordinary person can really understand it, and that's really close to my heart as a scientist myself, and trying to reduce the stigma and educate people around the beneficial and safe use of psychedelics. So that's why I really wanted to have you on the podcast today to just hear about your journey with psychedelic science. So first, I'd love to know, how did you get into the field of psychedelic research?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, it came from actually an interest in meditation and spirituality that I somehow got exposed to as a teenager. Like at around 16 years old, I remember being introduced to Zen Buddhism, and I was just fascinated by concepts around stilling and purifying the mind for greater insight and wisdom and attaining enlightenment. And all these ideas really enamored me. And it got me interested in broadly just ways to alter your consciousness or how we can change how we interface with the world. And then, around a year and a half later, I was, 17-ish. I had an experience on mushrooms at the beach with some friends, which really was a profound experience for me. It allowed me for the first time kind of to shift out of my, normal sense of self and see things from a broader perspective, and catalyzed a lot of introspection around how, we live in these pretty tunnel vision realities where we think we know what's what, we think we know who we are, and take a bit of mushrooms, modulate our brain chemistry a little bit, and it shifts us into a completely different world where like our thoughts are different, how we're perceiving others are different, how we feel is different. And this got me really interested. It's like, how is the brain creating this? Like, how is our structured relationship to the world maintained, and how can that be changed, and what's more healthy or more expansive, and all that. And so that put me on this path of being really interested in studying, at first it was philosophy, then it was philosophy and psychology, then cognitive science, and then cognitive neuroscience, and then kind of brain imaging moving forward. And then now I study how psychedelics work in the brain, and I'm living the dream.
Wow, that's amazing. I love it. You have such a curious mind, and that's the hallmark of a good scientist, isn't it? Always trying to
Right.
understand deeper, and the nature of reality ultimately.
Totally. Yeah, it's the coolest stuff. It's the coolest way to spend my time as far as I'm concerned.
Oh, amazing. And could you tell us a little bit about your research, over the last few years, and what's your kind of research focus at the moment?
Yeah, so my PhD was focused on something called the default mode network. So for a number of years, I focused on that, and that network is really interesting because it's um, it consists of the regions in our brain that are some of the most advanced. They're the ones that are most expanded relative to other primates, like chimps and bonobos, which are our closest genetic cousin. And these are the things that are kind of human defining, and they allow us to have a sense of self that we can think about and introspect on, and allow us to create abstractions and think about things that are not in the here and now, and basically do all these complex things. And so a lot of my work was characterizing this network and how it relates to different aspects of our thinking, how it connects to regions involved in emotion, and also how it's altered by psychedelics. And so one of the things I found during my PhD, analyzing data of people on psilocybin and LSD, is that these parts of the brain, the default mode network that I just mentioned, become less distinct from sensory areas. So areas involved in vision primarily,
Mm.
as well as our sense of touch. And so it seems that psychedelics kind of reduce the distinction between areas related to abstract thinking, and kind of, you know, you could say, yeah, concepts and abstract thinking versus our senses and information coming from our senses, and kind of blends them together. So there's more crosstalk. And, we're still exploring what exactly that can mean, but it can relate to a whole variety of things. And, that happen when you're under a psychedelic.
Mm.
And so that was a lot of my PhD work. And then now I'm working at UCSF with Robin Carhart-Harris, as you mentioned. And we're currently just wrapping up the biggest ever study of how psilocybin works in the brain. And
Amazing.
it's kind of intense. We're doing a lot to people. What we're
Wow.
doing is We bring people in for 4 sessions consecutive, usually 4 weeks in a row, every Friday. And the first day is 10 milligrams of psilocybin, which is about a gram to a gram and a half equivalent. And then the next 3 times, it's 25 milligrams of psilocybin. So it's around 3.5 grams of most strains. And so it's a decent dose, those ones are. And we're collecting a total of over 3 hours of brain data, some at the beginning, at the peak, and at the end. And so we're trying to see the whole arc of the experience
Wow, love
subjectively,
that.
experientially, and in the
Mm.
brain across 4 experiences to see all the variability and the dynamics of the experience and the states that people enter into and all that, and relating it to the brain and then relating it to changes in well-being and other things afterwards.
Wow, that's so fascinating, and I absolutely love these fMRI scans of the brain and seeing different parts are more active than other parts. I think coming back to the default mode network is that kind of how I understand it. It's the place where maybe is linked to the seat of people's ego, like their identification of themselves, and they're trying to find out now around the link to depression and this kind of default mode network. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. Yeah, it does a lot of things. It's very complex. So I wouldn't. A lot of people reduce it to the ego, but that's just
Yeah.
one aspect of it. But
Hmm.
I think what is true is that, for example, if you were to look at things you see as part of yourself and who you are. Let's say you really identify with being a soccer player. Then when somebody talks about soccer, areas in the default mode network might light up more for you,
Mm.
whereas for somebody else they won't. And
Okay.
so, what it does, one of the things it does is it tags things in our experience as worthy of more attention and focus because they're related to our sense of self. We call that self-related processing. And so our brain is actually actively, dynamically, you know, attributing selfness or selfhood to different
Mm.
things in our experience. And the default mode network does that. And also, the connection to the ego also comes to default mode network being involved in our personal narrative.
Hmm.
Our conception of this is who I am, this is who I think I'm going to be, this is who I think I've been in the past. That whole ability for a personal autobiographical narrative is encoded by the default mode network as well.
Wow. Yeah, incredible. It seems so complex. And I remember when I studied neuroscience in my undergrad, I was like, well, I prefer genetics, and that's what I did my PhD in was genetics. For me, neuroscience was always like a black box. It's just magic almost.
Right. Genetics is quite a lot as well. So
Yeah, yeah, it is. It's definitely up there for sure. And yeah, what from the current research then, what's the kind of the kind of therapeutic applications of this? Do you see, we'll be able to tailor the experiences better for people, or is it more around, dosage, or yeah, I'd love to if there's any insights there.
yeah, so a goal of the study, there's several, but one is kind of what you're saying. It's trying to see how people on an individual basis respond differently because
Mm,
everyone's psychedelic experiences are radically different, and even the same person taking it multiple times, each one's is going to be very different. This is how psychedelics work, and so we're trying to characterize that in more detail in the study, and that's what we have been doing.
hmm.
So it's kind of like, do people follow a particular arc across consecutive experiences? And is
Yeah.
that same or different across people? How can we predict what kind of arc they're going to experience? And this arc can be within experience and across experiences, right? And so I guess in some sense, it's along the lines of more personalized treatment models, and identifying that there's not one way that people respond to psychedelics, right? There's not one set of brain changes that we're like, oh, this is a psychedelic state. Because a psychedelic state, there's no one state, right? It's not a thing. There's no psychedelic state. There's a whole variety of psychedelic experiences or psychedelic states, like plural. And we're just trying to characterize that a bit more and see how, yeah, we can better personalize treatment and predict who's going to get better earlier on.
Hmm.
And it's also just honestly driven by curiosity. It's like, can we identify distinct states that happen, and relate them to the brain to then further understand the brain and how the brain is creating these experiences? So
Yeah.
there's several things there.
Yeah, amazing. I think it's such an exciting time because you guys are doing this work on psilocybin, but there's like so many different psychedelics and different psychedelic states, and I think as scientists we're going to have to figure out how they all kind of work on a brain level, molecular level, and then the idea of kind of personalized medicine. Will somebody benefit more from a ketamine experience, or will someone benefit from a 5-MeO toad experience for healing PTSD or trauma? Do you kind of see how will things kind of evolve that way in the world, do you think, in the psychedelic field, or what's your kind of insights on that?
Yeah, potentially. I think there's a lot of work to be done to get there. And right now, ketamine is used most often because it's legally available as an off-label treatment for mental health, whereas psilocybin MDMA are not, unless, there are exceptions, such as in Oregon and soon to be in Colorado, with
Mm.
psilocybin therapies being legally available. But I think in the future, it is possible, I think in principle, that somehow an intake based on a combination of questionnaires you give somebody, maybe their brain as well, you can identify, given your current brain connectivity patterns and these questionnaires, a personality or whatever, we think ketamine is a good thing to start. Or like psilocybin might be too risky to go into first, let's start with this.
Yeah.
Or this is more suitable for MDMA. So I think that's the ideal. But I think that's like at least a decade or more away to get there, but I think that would be really great to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes down to, for me, it's like reducing the stigma, educating people, finding out how these things work on a scientific level. And then we can really make, informed decisions if these kind of therapies, when they become full therapies for people, which will be right, which, and so, psychedelics are not for everybody. And I think we're kind of in a space where we're trying to figure out who is it actually for.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, psychedelics aren't like a panacea. They're not a magic bullet, right? And for a lot of people, it could just be too much, right? Because one of the ways that psychedelics work, and I'm sure you know this, is that they help people process difficult emotions and memories, and they kind of open you up and guide you to things you had been ignoring or suppressing. That can be really difficult and challenging. And some people are just not ready to face their deepest, darkest demons, right?
Mm.
And this is why a lot of bad trips happen outside of therapy contexts, because people are taking this at a festival or with friends kind of casually. And then all of a sudden, all this intense emotion is coming up, and then they get destabilized. And if they're not supported, they don't feel safe, they feel judged, they can go into a spiral of anxiety and fear. And that happens a lot of times in these contexts. And so I think they're really powerful molecules that can be really helpful for people, but they have to be um, you have to go into it with a strong intention and with the right preparation to be able to handle what comes up. And for some, that preparation involves a lot of therapy or a lot of other treatments before they're ready for something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's almost like the work is really before and then after, isn't it?
Yeah.
The set and setting, and then integration. Could you talk a little bit about those kind of topics for people who've never heard about maybe set and setting and integration?
Yeah, totally. So earlier I said, each psychedelic experience is radically different. It's not like drinking alcohol or taking Adderall. You kind of know what's going to happen when you do that, but when you take a high dose of psilocybin, it can go in a whole variety of directions, right? And the way we conceptualize that is that um, psychedelic effects are really context dependent. And then context speaks to set and setting. And so set and setting is a way of saying context. And so set is kind of your mindset. So your beliefs, expectations, your intentions, also where your mind and emotions are at the time of taking it. All these things you bring psychologically to the experience, and your personality, all these things are going to really influence the dynamics of the experience and what comes up. And that also within set, I would include your own trauma and your past life history, all the things you bring to it. And then setting is the environmental setting. Are you in a nice, comfortable, aesthetically pleasing physical environment? Do you feel safe and secure? And is it predictable? Or is it chaotic, unpredictable, and do you feel potentially judged? Right. And then I would include also in the setting your social setting. So do you feel like you trust the people around you? Do you feel them to support you and hold you in the right way if you have a difficult experience? All these things. And so the nature of your experience is going to really depend on all those factors, and it can go in any number of directions.
Yeah, I know it's incredible, and I think a lot of these kind of challenging experiences, bad trips, can really be mitigated by people working on set and setting. So if anybody's listening to this podcast and you're thinking about trying psychedelics, really tune in with someone who can professionally guide you or support you, and you know take care of the setting as much as possible. And it's kind of up to the individual really to take care of the set, isn't it?
Yeah, and but in terms of the set too, like in the studies, often there'll be a few preparation sessions you have with the therapist or guide who really help you get clear on what are you looking for from this experience, what's your intention, and also here are the best practices for approaching it, right? Because that it's we call it psychoeducation, right? So they provide psychoeducation on you're going to have this profound, you might have this profound experience. It's going to be quite intense. Fear and anxiety might come up. It might be challenging. But what they say is a core part of SET, and this is covered by the research actually, they find correlations between how much somebody is able to accept and surrender to the experience and how much benefit they get and how much mystical experience and positive experiences they have. And so, really, acceptance and surrender and feeling safe to do that, I think, are probably some of the most important things in terms of set. And then we guide them in the clinical studies towards that.
Oh, amazing. The kind of quote comes to my mind, Carl Rogers, I'm sure you're aware of him, when I accept myself exactly how I am, then I can change.
Right. True.
And I love his work. And, I love how, you also have a background in meditation too, and how these different modalities, they all really support the psychedelic experience. Could you talk a little bit about maybe some practices or tools for people to explore maybe before having a psychedelic experience?
Yeah, I think going in, it's important also just to be grounded in yourself and relaxed and to be in a place where you can let go of your everyday mundane concerns and kind of go into this experience. And I think to do that, as you mentioned, meditation and any kind of awareness oriented practice or embodying could be meditation, mindfulness, could be like somatic movements, just different techniques somatically, could be yoga, could even be dancing, intuitive dancing, or just any kind of dancing. I think what's really helpful is getting yourself in your body, out of your head, grounded, and creating a kind of internal spaciousness to hold the experience. Right? If we're full or if we're at capacity, we're anxious, our minds are racing, that it's probably going to be an anxiety-filled experience. And
Yeah.
so, just spending time in nature, grounding, doing all these things, breath work can also be really powerful. Whether it could just be as simple as circular breathing, you do for 15 minutes or something,
Hmm.
and just doing that on the few days before to level you out. I think all these things are really support having a more positive experience, and then doing them after can help ground and land the experience too, and create the spaciousness to integrate effectively.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's so important, isn't it, to really make sure you're going in with a level of nervous system regulation and having these supportive practices, just in case you do get met with any kind of emotions that are overwhelming. I know, I hear a lot of people here in Ireland at Irish festivals. They go, they drink some alcohol, and then they take some mushrooms or LSD, and then they have these really challenging experiences because they're coming in not regulated, and they can cause so much distress. So, having these practices even help during the experience. Could you talk a little bit about how psychedelics affect brain function and maybe neuronal or neural connectivity?
Yeah, so as you can imagine, it's quite complex, and there are actually a lot of competing perspectives to really conceptualize it in a useful way. Um, but I have a particular way I usually communicate it, and it also links to the default mode network, actually, although it's not exclusively related to that network. But what's interesting about that network is it has a large density of the particular brain receptors that psychedelics target the most. And this is the serotonin 2A receptor. So this is a receptor that's usually activated by serotonin, but psychedelics hit it in a slightly different way and target it, preferentially. They target it more than other receptors. And when you target this receptor in the default mode network, it makes neurons start to activate a lot more. As we would say, it makes them hyper-excitable. It's excitatory. And this actually disrupts the ongoing patterns of activity and leads these regions to start becoming more connected to the rest of the brain. And so when you see these images of psychedelics makes the brain interconnected, um, my sense based on the research is that the brain is becoming more interconnected because these areas, such as the default mode network, are driving that. They're just all of a sudden becoming active much more, and that's just causing all these new connections to start forming. And what this does, the effect this has, is that it disrupts our sense of self. It disrupts our ongoing narratives, our concepts and frameworks that we're using to explain the world, and it makes them less rigid and makes them more malleable, and allows us to see from a new perspective and potentially change our beliefs and thoughts about ourselves and the world and how things work. And that when harnessed in the therapy context with the right support, you can kind of see perhaps limiting beliefs you have about yourself or tendencies in how you perceive the world that are not accurate or are just holding you down, and change them and have the opportunity to see like, oh, like that doesn't quite make sense. Maybe you have the belief and you realize, oh, like I've really don't believe that I deserve love. And you might be able to have all these memories come up of you um, being loved, and like you seeing like, oh wait, like a lot of people do love me, like, oh, I am pretty great, oh, I am worthy of this. And you start to question these things which you were maybe taking for granted without even knowing you were taking for granted. And the idea is that this might be related to disrupting these brain circuits in the default mode network. And another thing psychedelics do through the serotonin 2A receptor is they increase neuroplasticity. And
Mm.
what that really means is they're basically stimulating neurons, which are brain cells, to start growing. Like they start to physically grow and create more protrusions out of them called dendrites, which allow other neurons to then connect to them. And so not only do psychedelics disrupt ongoing activity in these critical areas and reduce the rigidity of our thought processes, they also give your brain more resources to create new physical connections between brain cells, which then can support new ways of thinking and behaving and relating to the world. And so broadly, that's how I like to conceptualize it, because that kind of informs the psychology of it and the importance of integration, of taking actions then to cultivate and preserve those new connections that you want to cultivate.
Wow. So yeah, I haven't heard anybody say it so beautifully. So that's amazing, and this kind of idea of neuroplasticity. I think the world of neuroscience taught, that the brains are mostly set when we reach adulthood, but now we're seeing that, psychedelics can induce neuroplasticity, neurogenesis. I came across this term recently, psychoplastogens. Have you
Mm.
come across that one?
Yeah, that's a common one in the research literature, and it points to
Yeah.
the centrality of these plasticity promoting effects.
Yeah, amazing. And this is like really useful then for people who kind of have these ruminations and negative thought loops and, very limiting beliefs and of like, pessimistic kind of outlooks on the world, that the brain can kind of shift these beliefs, create new pathways of, seeing the world in a different way, new perspectives. I think it's such an exciting time for working on, the mind. I think this is like the biggest step we've had in the mind in many years, because I think even with antidepressants, there hasn't been any big shift or change in, how therapy's been done the last, what, 60, 50 years.
Yeah, since around the 80s is usually the number people give, right? It's just been mostly just small little improvements on the side effect profile of a drug or something like this, and there hasn't been any big innovations. And actually, the kind of um, the main innovation started with ketamine when discovering it had this effect for depression in around the year 2000, um, when they found that people who tried ketamine had a steep reduction in depression within hours, within 24 hours, that lasted usually for a week or two, then kind of trailed off. But that rapid antidepressant effect is very different than standard antidepressants. If you take every day, they have their full effect at around 4 to 6 weeks. But with ketamine and with psilocybin and the actual psychedelics, you get these rapid reductions, which last a long time after 1 to 3 experiences, right? And so with psilocybin, the studies 1 to 3 sessions, dosing sessions with the whole prep and integration, leads to, for some people, not everybody, but a year later, they're still not depressed, from 1 to 3 sessions. It's like you can't take 1 to 3 normal antidepressants like Lexapro or whatever, and be better a year later. That does not happen. And so they're
Mm.
fundamentally different in that way. And that's why they're so exciting, because they're kind of representing a whole new class of molecules with very different mechanisms, that can complement or go beyond these older ones.
Yeah, I think it's a really amazing time, and I see that psychedelics, they seem to really get to the wound. It's kind of like SSRIs, antidepressants. They're life saving medication for so many people out there, but I think that they blunt a lot for people. The highs and the lows, and people are very even. And like you were kind of saying, they don't. I feel like they don't get to the core wound sometimes. It's kind of like a band-aid of being able to function and get on. But when we take psychedelics, and it's important to mention to everybody that you need to do the preparation and integration too. It's not just you drink this, it's a magic bullet. It's going to
Yeah.
heal you, going to fix you. You need to do this kind of therapy before and therapy after to have the maximum kind of results.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, psychedelic therapy is not just taking psychedelics, right? It's a whole, as I was
Yeah.
mentioned before, it's a whole
Yes.
thing. It's contained within a lot of practices, and yeah, as I was saying, preparation, integration, as we're saying, right?
Mm,
It's like all of that is essential as the drug itself.
yeah.
If not perhaps even more important, because it's really about the changes you make in your life afterwards and how you set yourself up to make those changes.
Yeah, and that's it's the important of yeah, like you said, psycho education. What other are the kind of the biggest misconceptions the public have around psychedelics and their effects?
Yeah, we can maybe think about them in different categories. So one might be, maybe some people still believe that psychedelics will damage your brain. So things like psilocybin and DMT, mescaline, LSD even, they're extremely non-toxic for the brain. And so you can give, there's been doses where they give, studies where they give doses, way higher than you would ever give to a human, to rodents, and it doesn't cause brain damage, right? It doesn't physically harm neurons or other organs in your body for that matter. Um, but side note there, ketamine and MDMA do have potential for neurotoxicity. So ketamine and MDMA, I would not call psychedelics, because they don't work through the serotonin 2A primarily. And ketamine can cause issues with your bladder and urinary tract, and also could be neurotoxic if used in a prolonged way. Usually, if you're doing it every day or high doses on quite often basis recreationally, it can be harmful. And MDMA also in higher doses, and using it too much can be harmful for your brain. But but get back to psychedelics. So they're non-toxic. They're also non-addictive. They don't activate your dopamine system, in the way that things like heroin or meth or cocaine do. The dopamine system, like your reward system, is what makes things addictive, and psychedelics don't reliably activate that. Um, and in addition, psychedelics don't work by increasing serotonin in the brain. They work by activating serotonin receptors directly. So those are all like common brain misconceptions, I think. And then, also I think another one is you could take it and get better magically, right? The thing is, in these studies, on average, if you take a group of 30 people and look on average, people get much better. But if you go under the hood and look at individual people, some people in these studies get worse. Some people stay the same. Some people get better and then rebound hard. Some people get better, stay better a year later, right? You get the whole variety of things that happen. And so, psychedelics are complex. We're still trying to understand why some people respond, why others don't, and how we can help the people who respond better in the future. All these things, we're really just in the early stages of characterizing. And
Hmm.
so there's a lot we don't know about psychedelics. A lot we don't know about how they work in the brain. A lot we don't know about how they can be optimally applied in these clinical contexts. And so often I think people assume we're farther than we are in terms of the research as well.
Yeah, it's kind of like the embargo on research has really been so negative for so many people, and still I'm sure you're aware of the FDA decision with MDMA, and that kind of like that's probably set back MDMA being a treatment for PTSD now for a few more years, you think?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough because the main thing is MAPS and Lycos, right? They had to raise a lot of money for that phase 3 trial, and it's hard to do it, uh, in the context of not being a standard drug development company. And so it's a really huge challenge and lots of philanthropic donations and all these things to support that. And then now for them to have to go back and do another one of those after they had already shut down their research infrastructure, after they had already started to transition their organization towards commercialization and kind of the output, assuming acceptance. It's like a whole thing to cancel all that, go back to the start to raise funds over again after being rejected by the FDA. It's like a whole process. And so I think MDMA is going to be after psilocybin. I think psilocybin will be approved by the FDA before MDMA. And I think um, it will be something that opens the door for MDMA, instead of the other way around.
Mm.
Because there are a couple of organizations. There's Compass Pathways and the USONA Institute, who are both doing phase 3 trials on psilocybin right now for depression, and they're both these big studies. So phase 3 trials are what you submit to the FDA, and so they're on track to submit studies next year, and they have the funding to do it. So I think that's what I'm excited about, and that's what I'm looking towards right now.
Amazing. Yeah, I think here in Ireland as well, in Tala Hospital in Dublin, Compass Pathway are hosting some clinical trials for psilocybin. So, everyone's also really excited about it here at this side of the world. At this time of the year as well, Liberty Cap, psilocybe semi-lanciata grow all across Ireland. They're kind of seen as our indigenous psychedelic medicine here in Ireland. So, it'd be so wonderful if psilocybin was one of the first. I think as Irish people would be very happy. Whether people go for clinical trials or go out to the hills and pick magic mushrooms, that's a whole nother story and another conversation probably for another day.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the things that I'd love to ask you about is, how do you see this kind of evolving? We have MDMA for PTSD, psilocybin for maybe treatment resistant depression. There's big news around ibogaine or iboga for a strong chronic addiction. How do you kind of see this evolving? Do you think there'll be like a psychedelic hospital of the future where you go in, you have your conditions, and you go into a room and you get this psychedelic, that psychedelic? Um, yeah, how do you see this all evolving?
Yeah, I think I would love to see something like you described. I think in the end, it's going to be psychiatrists and maybe GPs and stuff prescribing these things to people, but not prescribing the sense of giving them mushrooms to take home, but kind of referring them to, kind of validated and chosen centers, psychedelic centers, clinics, right? And there's already that model for ketamine, and I think what is essentially, these some of these ketamine clinics is going to be replaced or expanding into these psilocybin and ketamine clinics, and then psilocybin, ketamine, and whatever. So psychedelic clinics. And the ideal way I would love to see it is like seeing them as holistic treatment centers where psychedelics are just one tool or just a set of tools of many, including what I mentioned before, like somatic techniques, mindfulness, meditation, diet and nutrition advice, and incorporating exercise is something that could be prescribed, and these kind of holistic life treatment centers which try to heal and help the whole individual,
Mm.
with psychedelics being the ones for psychological function and trauma and any host of things. And so I would love to see that happening. That would probably be far down the line, but in the end, when psilocybin is available, it's going to be for licensed treatment centers that are where the people there have to go on some kind of validated training that is similar to how it was studied in the clinical trials. I think that would happen first, and then hopefully things will become more lax as years go on.
Hmm. I loved how the Japanese, if someone's feeling depressed, they prescribe forest bathing.
Yeah, and a lot of the times that'll work. That'll do the trick. It's much better than some pharmaceutical.
Yeah, yeah. No, and in my work over the last 6 years with Inward Bound, we really found that on the retreats we give high doses of psilocybin truffles in the Netherlands, in a legal and safe setting. That this kind of um connectivity and connection is really the medicine, and I think there's wonderful science trying to understand, this kind of connectivity to self, to others, to nature, to the natural world, and how this is actually medicine for a lot of people.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and that's something that's emphasized more and more is like the sense of connectedness that people feel. Because the opposite of that, you could say, is isolation, and that's something that's like more and more prevalent in developed societies is feeling this kind of isolation and loneliness, and there's like an epidemic of these things, and also depression is characterized by feelings of isolation,
Hmm.
and so for a drug to so potently be able to induce feelings of connectedness to ourselves, to others, to the universe, to nature, that could be deeply healing and basically is exactly what a lot of people need. And so that's also another exciting effect that psychedelics can have when properly supported in the right context and all that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, I think microdosing as well. Could you speak a little bit about that, microdosing? Because I know some of your works around that these days.
Yeah, microdosing is an interesting topic. It's a bit, in terms of the research world, it's a bit complex. On one side, there's a lot of studies with surveys and kind of self-report studies where people are talking about their experiences with microdoses and asked about it, showing that it helps people with all sorts of things, regulating their mood, reducing anxiety, focusing, being more creative, all these things. But then, if you look in the actual studies when you bring them into the lab and use a placebo control and compare it to placebo, a good fraction of the studies found no difference between placebo and microdose, which is to say that microdosing did work, but also it worked for people who got a sugar pill and thought they got a microdose. Right?
The good old placebo effect.
Yeah, exactly. So there's been multiple studies that have found that, but I want to stress that not all studies have found that. Some have found that people do have benefits for different things greater than placebo, or that some have asked people what they expect, what their expectations are, and they've seen effects that go against those expectations. Right. So it's not all expectation and placebo effect, but there is a strong placebo factor there. And what I personally think is that um, microdoses likely create a kind of low grade sustained increase in neuroplasticity that make us more sensitive to whatever we're doing. And so I think combining microdosing with some kind of protocol, such as a meditation practice or some new habits or putting yourself in positive environments, it's going to make those things that you're doing imprint you and your brain a bit more. And so I don't think microdosing is something you just take and you ignore what you're doing in your life. It's like you take it and you make lifestyle adjustments, which can then synergize with it and maybe improve outcomes.
Mm.
So I think that hasn't been adequately studied yet. The combination of microdosing with things, we're still a lot of the research is treating it like, oh, just take a microdose and see what happens, right?
Yeah, it's not just like a vitamin. A lot
Yeah,
of,
exactly.
I think, it comes down to education again. A lot of people think, oh, I just take this microdose and I'll be fine. But it's really about kind of cultivating a holistic, kind of healthy, kind of, um, I suppose, would you say, kind of, not maybe not spiritual, but like a life with a daily practice and a life with,
Yeah,
you're doing the correct
intentional.
things. Intentional. Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. No, I agree. I mean, I'm all about, holistic health and treating the whole individual and acknowledging that we're just, each individual and our mental health is just the intersection of so many different things, right? It's our social relationships, our diet, our microbiome health, whether we have inflammation in our body or not from various things, our psychological life, our thinking, of course, how much we're exercising, our metabolic health. All these things are deeply intertwined with how we feel on a day to day. And just treating one as if that's the central thing and ignoring the others is not going to work. It's not a sustainable strategy.
Mm.
So I really believe in just like treating the whole individual in this way.
Yeah, it's so important that I think we kind of blend all of these, the Western kind of education of the mind, Eastern philosophy, and kind of bring it all together. I was a really big fan of Roland Griffiths, and his work around the mystical experience and these spiritual experiences where people, have the almost the biggest benefit from the psychedelic sessions when they have these kind of mystical and spiritual experiences, Could you talk into kind of maybe the intersection of psychedelic spirituality and these kind of mystical experiences?
Yeah, it's been interesting. So, I mean, one of the things that actually spearheaded this whole new wave of psychedelic research was Roland Griffith's study published in 2006, which is a replication of a 1963 study that found that psychedelics can reliably induce mystical experiences, which are similar to those reported by, saints, mystics, yogis, and stuff over history. And this was a fascinating finding, and people had rated those experiences as some of the most meaningful of their life and made a lot of changes in their life. And then several of the clinical trials that came over a decade later using psilocybin for depression found correlations between how much they had a mystical experience and how much they got better. And so there does seem to be a major spiritual component in terms of feeling a oneness with the universe, feeling a sense of euphoric bliss and intuitive knowledge of how things work and who we are, and all these things which transcend the mind, which seem to happen in the psychedelic experience that seem to be related to getting better and just, viewing your life in a new way. Um,
Mm.
and at the same time, I should say though that there have been a couple clinical trials that did not find a correlation between mystical experiences and getting better. And in fact, there are a variety of other things that also strongly correlate with getting better, such as there's two measures which are used in our lab a lot. One is measuring something that we call emotional breakthroughs. And so an emotional breakthrough is when you move in and through difficult emotions, basically. It's having a cathartic experience of processing some, whether it's a trauma or just an intense emotional experience that was never processed in the past, and having it come up and working through it and finding a resolution. That happens quite often too. And that happens relatively independently of mystical experiences and can help people get better as well. And then in addition to that is having psychological insights, like seeing on a cognitive level how you're showing up in your relationships or how you're behaving, and having insight into your patterns that aren't serving you. That too can happen independently of emotional breakthroughs and mystical experiences.
Mm.
It could be cases where all three of them come together, where two of them happen, the other one doesn't, or one of them and the other two don't. Like there's different, permutations of types of experiences you can have, which can be therapeutic. And
Hmm.
so something I like to emphasize, and I would put this under the other the misconception list, is that you don't need a mystical experience to get better with psychedelics. It's
Yeah.
just one experience of many, as profound as it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we can have the experience of, what does the scientific literature call it at the moment? Oceanic boundlessness,
Right.
bliss and, joy and, all the good feelings. It doesn't have to be down deep in the dark, the catharsis, the challenges. It could also be these kind of, beautiful experiences that are probably equally as beneficial to people as well. So, I just think it's so fascinating this at this time, seeing how all these different experiences can affect people, and this work with the mind. I know there was a paper there recently around I think it's a mystical paper, almost like the desynchronization of the brain, where time
Mm.
perception and yeah, sense of self, and that kind of lasts for several weeks after as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, we're just that was an interesting paper where they did find lasting effects related to the deep hormone network and related to the self and all these things. And again, we're just starting. We're just at the very early stages of characterizing this stuff, and we know that psychedelics can have profound, lasting effects. And when held right, these are positive effects a lot of the time. They help with different conditions, and I think it's fascinating to see what exactly is happening in the brain. And that was a cool study that's like shed some further light on that.
And they got the coveted Nature paper.
Yeah, they got a psychedelic brain imaging paper into Nature. That's not an easy thing to do.
No, not at all. I remember when I was working in the lab, anybody got a Nature paper, that's your career made.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I still love to read the odd paper here and there in the different fields, But yeah, before we start to wrap up, what do you kind of see, and what kind of excites you most about the future of psychedelic science? Like, what breakthroughs do you really hope to see in the next few years?
Yeah, so I mean, in addition to psychedelics becoming an improved medicine, which psilocybin will in the next few years, I'm pretty confident that it'll happen. I think just exploring the value of psychedelics for healthy people. right?
Yeah.
Quote unquote healthy, whatever that is defined as, right? And in terms of finding more meaning and purpose in their lives, having more harmonious relationships, and unlocking greater creativity and just optimal performance. I think there's a lot of applications outside of just treating mental health conditions. Also like deepening your meditation practice and sense of spirituality, your spiritual awareness and connection. I think people use psychedelics for all these things in the real world, in the underground. And since we've been really focused on mental health because that's where a lot of the funding is, that's kind of a primary concern given the world and all this. I think also exploring how it could push the needle forward for people who are already healthy and functioning, just to be, to reach deeper levels of human development and human potential, and all that. I think that's something I'm really excited about, and actually recently became the director of research for an organization called the Center for Minds.
Mm.
And their whole thing is using psychedelics, but also just consciousness tools in general, whether it's mindfulness, meditation, embodiment practices, breath work, for helping stimulate creativity and insight based problem solving for solving the world's major challenges in terms of science and engineering. And they're really trying to spearhead that kind of non-clinical work on using psychedelics as these catalysts that can then make a difference, in change makers in the world. And these are stuff, things I'm getting more and more engaged with and find fascinating and really promising.
Oh, amazing. That's such a fulfilling work, really. You're living your passion. And I think, it's so important to try and get these kind of practices and tools out to, people in positions of power and leadership, where they can, have these experiences, and then it trickles down through the organizations, creates positive change, particularly politicians. I saw,
Yeah.
there's some there was a funny reel on, Donald Trump going to the Amazon, drinking ayahuasca and becoming the
Oh,
world's
the
greatest.
AI generated
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. But maybe, like, 10 years, who knows if politicians might start getting on the train.
Yeah, yeah, you would hope so. I think as it becomes more sanctioned and more less fringe and more mainstream, I would love to see a world where it's normalized. If somebody's having, mental health issues, to go and have a sanctioned psychedelic experience. And I
Yeah,
think there's going to be a lot of the secondary things that maybe people don't expect. It's like, oh, I
yeah.
feel more spiritual now. Oh, like maybe my beliefs have changed.
Hmm.
And this is happening in the studies. So I think that's really exciting.
Yeah, wonderful. And thanks again to you and your work and your kind of passion for educating people. This really reduces the stigma, and is really, getting the word out there of how powerful these can be if used in a, safe, responsible, sacred way for some people as well. And yeah, so thanks for doing the science and for the educating people. Yeah, so Dr. Manesh, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for taking the time. Where can people kind of find out more about your work and the projects you're involved in?
For sure, yeah. I mean, it's been a pleasure to chat. This was a lot of fun, and so people can find me on YouTube and Instagram. It's the Psychedelic Scientist, as you mentioned. I can also put a little shameless plug for a course I recently created. I call it the Psychedelic Medicine Masterclass, and it's a curated one-stop shop of all the main topics in psychedelic science. It's about 7 hours of videos I've made, and I've co-written the 200-page ebook that distills over 200 studies, peer-reviewed studies on psychedelics and related topics. And you can go to maneshgirn.com/masterclass to check that out.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. And it sounds like I will definitely sign up to that course.
Wonderful.
And for anybody who's interested in more of Manesh's work, I'll put everything in the show notes, the links, so you can find them there. So yeah, thanks again. It's been an absolute pleasure, and yeah, I hope to meet you in person someday.
Yeah, totally. This was a lot of fun. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.